Hello, my name is Timothy Kim, and my quarter project is on the influenza pandemic of 1918. The current coronavirus epidemic is the main topic of discussion today. However, there was a pandemic far worse and more impactful. Imagine a time where a virus caused more than 50 million deaths worldwide. The Spanish flu was just that. The Spanish flu did not discriminate. It was socially neutral, meaning that the poor and the rich were affected equally. With so many deaths, many questioned, what made the Spanish flu so deadly? This widespread pandemic was the result of several factors, accumulating in an unfortunate environment for the virus to take hold. Generational changes, as well as effects from the Great War, contributed to the spread of this virus, permanently changing the way the world handles disease control. The Spanish flu was particularly devastating because it targeted not only the weak, the young, and the old, but also the often resilient adults. History shows a U-shaped mortality curve for most illnesses and influenza, where the ends of the age spectrum are most affected. This, however, was different for the Spanish flu, as there was a spike in the middle of the mortality graph where you can see adults aged 20 to 40 were most affected. While history shows that most epidemics have a U-shaped mortality graph, meaning that the ends of the age spectrum are most heavily affected, the Spanish flu, however, was very different. It created a W-shaped curve. This curve displayed that the adults were also extremely susceptible to the Spanish flu. The unusual peak at the center of the spectrum proved deadliest for those aged 20 to 40, killing not only the weak, but also the strongest people within a population. The reason for this mortality curve is due to the fact that the adults aged 20 to 40 were most likely only introduced to the protein H3 when they were growing up and building up their immune system. However, this new flu had the H1 protein, making it incredibly vulnerable to those aged 20 to 40, which were not yet immune to this type of protein. Adults were only exposed to H3 subtypes and suffered great losses when an H1 protein flu emerged. Limited H1 exposure stunted their immunity. On the other hand, children were developing their immune systems through constant exposure and managed to persevere their age group. This created a huge issue as those people aged 20 to 40 were the ones tasked with treating those with the Spanish flu. With military patients coming home from the war with battle wounds and mustard gas burns, hospital facilities and staff were taxed to the limit. This created a shortage of physicians, especially in the civilian sector, as many had been lost for service with the military. With the new H1 protein emerging and the new generation change switching targeting the people aged 20 to 40, this was one of the main reasons for the Spanish flu's great success. With the movement of thousands of troops due to the war and war-related activities, the virus spread rapidly. The virus traveled with military personnel from camp to camp and across the Atlantic at the height of the American military involvement in the war. September through November 1918, influenza and pneumonia sickened 20 to 40% of the U.S. Army and Navy personnel. However, the end of the war only brought more suffering. As people celebrated Armistice Day with parades and large parties, a complete disaster from the public health standpoint, a rebirth of the epidemic occurred in some cities. The flu that winter was beyond imagination as millions were infected and thousands died. The war infected thousands, but the end of the war exposed the world. With the return of soldiers, reunions with young and old family members, and large-scale celebrations, the virus reached a new peak. With the mass movements created by World War I and the many parades and public gatherings that came with the end of the war, these were the huge main factors for the Spanish flu being so impactful. In response to the millions of deaths, many countries became more involved in public health and containing epidemics, eventually leading to the establishment of the World Health Organization. Because, with the Spanish flu, most countries did not take preventative action, they were only able to act in response. When the flu initially came to the US, it did not cause many casualties and was dismissed. This proved a grim miscalculation when the military brought the second wave of the virus. It could not be denied that health ministries required more funding, more authority to educate the public, and the legitimacy to prevent future pandemics. However, the existence of these establishments were no longer an option but a necessity. The year 1919 saw an opening in Vienna, Austria, of an international bureau for fighting epidemics, a forerunner of today's World Health Organization. The Spanish flu left its mark on history through the Great War, the lack of precautionary measures, and the new protein strand within the virus. The war mobilized the infection, exposing thousands regardless of age, nationality, and social class. The impact of the Spanish flu was unlike any other pandemic preceding it. It has permanently transformed the way people view contagious infections. The role of the government in public health was also changed. The World Health Organization is a direct result of this virus. In present day, as the coronavirus continues to infect people around the world, the education and preventative measures we learned from the Spanish flu is more relevant than ever.
But Spain wasn't in World War I, and since they had no reason to hide anything, they reported their flu-related deaths. Even the King of Spain, Alfonso XIII, got the disease, but ultimately survived. So with the spotlight on Spain, US and European news outlets nicknamed it the Spanish flu. But the flu was spreading well outside of Spain, and with a large scale of infections going unreported, no one was prepared for the deadly pandemic it would become. Today, we know the flu is a highly contagious viral infection that spreads to the nose, throat, and sometimes the lungs. Symptoms such as fever, nausea, aches, and a sore throat are all standard. It's a terrible, possibly fatal disease that confines the afflicted to bed for days. But the 1918 flu was worse. Dark spots would appear on the body before the skin turned blue from a lack of oxygen in their blood. And patients would bleed from their noses and ears as they suffocated on their own blood and fluids. In 1918 at Camp Funston, U.S. Army Dr. Roy Grist remarked, "It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible." The outbreak at Camp Funston affected more than 1,000 soldiers, and around 40 died. But those 1,000 were part of 1 million soldiers throughout the United States who were all in contact with one another. Those soldiers were then sent overseas in the spring of 1918, carrying flu microbes that would spread faster than the war itself. In the fall of that same year, a second wave of flu cases started spreading across the U.S., hitting both military and civilian centers. Doctors had never before seen such a deadly strain of influenza. To make matters worse, knowledge of viruses at the time was limited, since microscopes of the day were not powerful enough to see them. People began blaming the Germans, claiming they were spreading poison clouds or that Bayer, which was a German-owned company, had infected their aspirin. As the flu spread in America, even public health officials began to lie about the state of things. Like Philadelphia's public health director Wilmer Cruson, who in September of 1918 declared, "No concern whatever is felt," after a Navy ship from Boston arrived with infected passengers. The next day, 2 sailors died. The day after that, 14. There was little to be done to stop the spread of the virus. Doctors had no way to create a vaccine, antiviral drugs, or even antibiotics for secondary infections like pneumonia. Instead, most prevention efforts focused on quarantine and personal hygiene. Schools, churches, and other public gathering spaces were shut down in many cities. In San Francisco, they went so far as to fine people $5 who didn't wear protective masks, dubbing them mask slackers. And in the end, after only 1 year, the death toll was catastrophic. To put things in perspective, more than 16 million people died in World War I. The Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people, and some believe the number may be closer to 100 million. In the US alone, 675,000 people would die from the flu. That's more American deaths than American soldiers who died in World War I. It's more than all the deaths of American soldiers in the 20th century combined. And in October of 1918, 195,000 Americans died. making it one of the deadliest months in U.S. history. Death was so prevalent between the war and flu that life expectancy in the U.S. dropped by 12 years.
This concludes my presentation on the Spanish flu. Thank you for listening and have a good day.